The ink on Maria Keating's fingers never fully washed out, and that was fine by her, because those dark stains were the only proof some mornings that the words she put to paper were real. It was the spring of 1878, in a stretch of New Mexico territory that sat stubborn and sun-baked between the Rio Hondo to the north and the Pecos River to the south. The town of Callow Creek had grown up in that narrow corridor, the way most frontier towns did, crooked and unplanned, with a livery stable on one end and a cemetery on the other, and everything worth arguing about arranged in between. There were saloons and dry goods stores, a blacksmith, a doctor who drank too much but still managed to set bones correctly, a preacher who drank too little and still managed to set nerves on edge, and right in the middle of Main Street, occupying a former feed store whose thick adobe walls kept the heat outside in summer and the cold outside in winter, was the Callow Creek Courier. Maria Keating had founded it herself 4 years prior, at the age of 26, after inheriting a modest sum from her father and a printing press from a man named Josiah Crane, who had intended to start a paper in Santa Fe, but died of a fever before he ever could. People in town had told her that a woman running a newspaper was not something the territory needed. She had listened to every one of those opinions carefully, written none of them down, and opened the Courier anyway on a Tuesday in April with an edition that covered the disputed water rights of 3 local ranchers, the arrival of a new schoolteacher from Ohio, and a recipe for chokecherry preserves that her neighbor Mrs. Alvarez had graciously provided to fill the last 2 inches of column. 4 years on, the Courier was the only newspaper between the Rio Hondo and the Pecos. People subscribed to it from ranches 15 miles out. The territorial governor had once cited one of her editorials in an official correspondence. She had a girl named Della who helped her set the type on Wednesdays, and a boy named Tomas who ran deliveries on Thursdays, and she had a gray cat named Franklin who slept on the type cases and shed hair into the letters, which occasionally made for unusual spelling in the morning edition. Maria was 30 years old that spring. With dark brown hair she wore pinned up because loose hair and a printing press were an invitation to disaster, and eyes the color of strong coffee, and a way of looking at a person that made them feel both entirely seen and carefully evaluated at the same time. She was not unkind. She was simply precise. She believed that words had weight and that putting the wrong ones in print was the same as lying under oath, and she held herself to that standard even when it cost her advertising from men who did not like what she wrote. She had written honestly about the corrupt land assessor who had been cheating Mexican families out of their property claims. She had written honestly about the cattle baron to the north who had fenced off a public water source. She had written about disease outbreaks and drought conditions, and the genuine terror that Comanche raids had brought to outlying settlements, and she had written with equal honesty that those raids were often responses to broken treaties and stolen land, a position that had earned her 2 canceled subscriptions, and a letter from someone who called himself a patriot of the territory, and whose handwriting suggested he had not had much schooling. She had written about nearly everything in Callow Creek. But she had not written about Abraham Doyle, not yet, not honestly anyway. She had printed his name once in a brief notice about his arrival in town 6 months prior, the same bland paragraph she gave any new resident. Abraham Doyle, 32 years of age, late of Texas, had established himself on a modest property 3 miles east of town along Cutter Creek and was engaged in small-scale cattle ranching. 2 sentences, a period, then an advertisement for Mrs. Henley's millinery shop. What she had not printed was anything that came after those first 2 sentences. She had not printed the conversation she had overheard at the general store when he had quietly paid the outstanding tab of the Morales family without mentioning it to them or anyone else. She had not printed what Tom Danvers the blacksmith had told her, that Abraham Doyle had ridden out in the night during the cold snap in January to pull old Pete Garrity's cattle away from a frozen stretch of the creek, working for 3 hours in the dark without being asked. She had not printed what she had seen herself, which was Abraham standing in the street one afternoon in February, patiently and without condescension, explaining to a young Navajo boy how to read the face of a pocket watch. The two of them bent over the small brass circle together, while the rest of the street went about its business. She had not printed any of it because to print it would be to acknowledge that she had been paying attention to Abraham Doyle in a way that went considerably beyond her professional interest in the residents of Callow Creek. She told herself she was simply gathering material. She told herself that the habit of observation was a journalist's most necessary tool. She told herself this with great conviction on the mornings when she found herself lingering near the window of the courier's front office, because she could see from that angle a portion of the road that led to and from his property. She told herself all of this and believed none of it. The trouble had begun, as she would later admit to herself with some exasperation, at a town council meeting in November of the previous year. Maria attended every town council meeting, because town council meetings were where decisions got made, and where powerful men said the quiet parts loudly if you let them talk long enough, which they always did. She sat at the back with her notebook and her pencil, and she wrote down everything, and she had been doing this for 4 years without incident. Abraham Doyle had walked in near the start of the November meeting and taken a seat 2 rows ahead of her. She had noticed him because she noticed everyone. He was tall and lean in the way that men who did real physical work tended to be, not the exaggerated breadth of someone trying to look dangerous, but the kind of build that came from actual daily labor in the sun and wind. He had dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that she would describe in her private thoughts, strictly against her own better judgment, as distractingly well-formed. He wore practical clothes without adornment. He had removed his hat when he came inside, which roughly half the men at those meetings never bothered to do. She had catalogued all of this in approximately 8 seconds, and then returned her attention to the council chairman, who was droning about water easements. The meeting had turned contentious, as they often did, when Harlan Price had brought up his proposal to expand the eastern grazing boundary in a way that would have effectively cut off 2 smaller ranchers from their access to the creek. Price was the largest landowner in the county, a big, red-faced man who had the council chairman in his pocket, and who tended to present his interests as community interests in a way that made Maria want to grind her teeth to powder. The 2 smaller ranchers, both of whom she knew by name, had sat quiet and red-faced in their chairs, the way men did when they knew they were being cheated but did not have the language or the standing to articulate it clearly. Abraham Doyle had raised his hand with a calmness that was somehow more arresting than if he had stood up shouting. He had then proceeded to cite from memory the relevant sections of the territorial water law as it applied to riparian rights along established creek access corridors, and to demonstrate, using a sketch he produced from his breast pocket as though he had come prepared, that Price's proposed boundary expansion was not only unfair but was likely illegal under the current territorial statutes. Harlan Price had gone very red in a different way. The council chairman had shuffled his papers. The 2 smaller ranchers had looked at Abraham with expressions that combined relief and gratitude in equal measure. Maria had written down every word. Afterward outside, she had intended to approach him professionally, as she approached everyone, with her notebook in hand and a question ready. Instead, she had found herself standing on the boardwalk in the cool November air watching him accept the thanks of the 2 ranchers with a brevity that seemed genuine rather than affected. And when he had looked up and caught her watching him, he had not looked away first. She had, which was unusual for her, and she had not been entirely pleased with herself about it. She had written up the meeting for the Courier with full accuracy, including his argument about the water rights, and she had identified him only as a community member who had raised the legal concern, because she had told herself that was the journalistically appropriate framing, and not at all because she was rattled by the directness of his brown eyes and the way he had smiled slightly when she finally looked away. In the months since November, Callow Creek had provided her with no shortage of genuine news to occupy herself with. There was the ongoing matter of the contested land grants along the southern stretch, a bureaucratic tangle that the federal land office in Santa Fe seemed entirely uninterested in resolving, and which had left 5 families in a genuine state of uncertainty about whether they owned their homes. There was the question of the new railroad spur that the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was rumored to be considering routing through the territory, which would change everything about the economics of the region if it happened. There was a drought beginning to make itself felt in the dry spring, the grass coming in thin and yellow where it should have been green, the creek levels a full foot lower than this time last year. Maria had written about all of it. She had also written, in the privacy of her own journal rather than in the pages of the Courier, about Abraham Doyle being the most quietly remarkable man she had encountered in 4 years of watching this town carefully. And then she had closed the journal and put it in the locked drawer of her desk and gone back to setting type. The story she had not yet had the courage to print was not really about Abraham Doyle's good deeds or his legal knowledge or his steady presence in the life of the town. It was simpler than that and considerably harder to admit. The story she had not had the courage to print was that Maria Keating, who prided herself on honesty and precision and the unflinching reporting of the true nature of things, had fallen entirely in love with a man she had barely spoken to. And the thing that frightened her was not the feeling itself, but the size of it, the way it had grown from that November evening without her permission or participation, until it had become the largest and most real thing in her interior life. Sitting there in the locked drawer of her heart, the way the journal sat in the locked drawer of her desk, she was terrified of it. She was also terrified of what would happen if she did nothing, and the feeling simply went on growing in the dark. The morning that changed everything began ordinarily enough, with the smell of ink and the complaint of the printing press, which had developed a periodic rattle somewhere in its mechanism that she had been meaning to have looked at for 2 weeks. Maria was working on the Thursday edition, which was supposed to go to press in the morning and be delivered by afternoon. She had an article about the drought, an article about the contested land grants that she had been researching for 6 weeks, and which was finally coming together into something she was genuinely proud of, and a letter to the editor from the Reverend Hoskins about the moral character of the territory that she was going to print, because she believed in printing a range of views even when one of them made her jaw tight. She was reading over the land grants article for the final time when the door opened and Abraham Doyle walked into the Courier. Maria had the particular quality, developed from years of practice, of being able to appear entirely composed when she was not. She looked up from her papers with an expression she intended to convey professional openness, and which she suspected conveyed something more like the look of a woman who had just been startled by a very large and apparently friendly dog. He was holding his hat, which she had already noted was something he always did indoors, and there was a quality in his expression that she could not immediately categorize. Not urgency exactly, something more careful than that. "Miss Keating," he said. His voice was low and deliberate, the kind of voice that suggested he thought about what he said before he said it. "I apologize for coming without notice. I wondered if I could speak with you about something." "Of course," she said, and she gestured to the chair beside her desk, which was currently occupied by Franklin the cat, who regarded Abraham with the profound indifference of a creature who had decided the world owed him comfort. "You can move the cat. He will pretend to be offended and then forget about it immediately." Abraham looked at the cat and then at her, and something in his expression shifted, very slightly, into what she had come to recognize over 6 months of careful and entirely unprofessional observation, as the particular way his face moved when he was genuinely amused. He lifted Franklin with a gentleness that the cat did not deserve and set him on the floor and sat down, "I want to talk to you about the land grants article," he said. Maria set her pencil down. "Have you been following it? Every piece you have printed on it. 4 articles over 2 months." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "I also did some research of my own. I have a contact in Santa Fe, a man who works as a clerk at the land office, and he provided me with some information that I think you need to have before you print that article." She took the paper he offered and unfolded it. She read it carefully, and as she read, she felt the familiar electric sharpening that came with a story getting bigger and more important than she had initially understood it to be. What he had brought her was a copy of an internal memorandum from the Territorial Land Office, dated 3 months prior, confirming that a federal agent named Gerald Cass had been falsifying the records of land grant disputes across 4 counties, consistently ruling in favor of Anglo claimants over the original Hispanic and Mexican families, who held grants that predated American territorial acquisition. The memorandum noted that Cass was under internal review, but that the review had been ongoing for 9 months with no resolution, during which time 11 families had lost their property claims. "This is extraordinary," Maria said. She said it quietly, the way she said important things. 7 of those 11 families live within 20 miles of Callow Creek," Abraham said. 3 of them I know personally. The Delgado family lost their grandfather's property grant last winter. They have been living in a cousin's barn." She looked up from the paper. "How did your contact in Santa Fe obtain this?" "He made a copy he should not have made, to be honest with you, because he has a conscience and the patience for doing nothing had run out." Abraham's jaw was set in that way she had observed before, a kind of controlled steadiness that indicated genuine feeling held very quiet. "He does not want his name in the paper. He could lose his position." "I would not print his name," Maria said. "I would not print yours either if you preferred it that way." "I don't mind you printing my name," he said. "I think someone in this county ought to be willing to have their name on something." She looked at him for a moment. "You could have brought this information to the sheriff or to the county commissioner. Sheriff Aldridge has known about the Delgado situation for 4 months and done nothing. The county commissioner has dinner with Harlan Price twice a week." He said this without heat, as a statement of documented fact, which was, she thought, the most devastating possible way to say it. "I brought it to the Courier because the Courier is the only institution in this county that has consistently tried to tell the truth about what is happening here." The silence that followed this was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settled around something real. "I need a few days," Maria said. "I need to verify what I can verify independently before I print any of this. I also need to speak with the families who were affected. If this is going to do what it needs to do, it needs to be exact and it needs to be unassailable." "Whatever you need," Abraham said. He rose from the chair and reached for his hat. "I should let you work, Mr. Doyle." She said it without entirely deciding to, and he paused at the door. She had been writing about this town for 4 years, and she knew that the important things were the ones you said when you had not prepared them. "Thank you for bringing this to me. A great many people who had this information would have decided it was not their concern." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the sense that he was measuring something. "Those families are my neighbors," he said simply, and left. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds after the door closed, and then she opened her journal and wrote down exactly what she was feeling, in her most precise language, because she was a journalist and precision was how she understood the world. And what she wrote was this: "I am in love with Abraham Doyle and I have been for months, and I am going to continue to do nothing about it because I am, apparently, a coward." Then she closed the journal, put it back in the locked drawer, and went to work on the land grants article. The next 3 days were among the most satisfying she had spent since founding the Courier, and also among the most complicated. She wrote out to 3 of the families named in the memorandum. She spoke with Elena Delgado, A woman in her 50s with a spine like iron and eyes that had cried everything they were going to cry and arrived at something harder and cleaner on the other side, who told her the full story of the land grant her father had held since before the territory became American territory, and how Gerald Cass had appeared at their door one morning with papers that bore official seals and declared the grant invalid, and how no amount of argument or documentation had moved him. She spoke with two other families, the Ruiz family and the Montoya family, and heard similar accounts with similar details, the same agent, the same official seals, the same immovable official indifference. Abraham Doyle accompanied her on the second day, because he knew the roads and he knew the families, and because she had found herself, somewhat against her professional inclinations, grateful for the company. He rode a bay horse with quiet competence, and he introduced her to the families with a warmth that was neither patronizing nor performative. And he translated when the older members of the Montoya family spoke primarily in Spanish, doing so with patience and accuracy, and none of the impatient hurrying that some men did when they translated for people they considered less educated. On the road back to Callow Creek in the evening of the second day, with the sky turning the particular color of burned copper that it got over the desert in spring, Maria asked him something she had been considering for 2 days. "You know territorial law fairly well." "I did some reading," he said. The horses moved easily side by side on the wide road. People who have done some reading do not cite statute numbers from memory in town council meetings. He was quiet for a moment. "I read law for 2 years in Austin before I decided it was not what I wanted to do with my life. I did not finish, but I retained most of what I learned." "Why did you stop?" Another pause, longer this time. "My father died. There were things that needed doing. And I am not certain I was suited to argue on behalf of people I did not believe deserved arguing for, which is what a good deal of legal practice involves." "You could argue on behalf of the Delgados," she said. "I am not a lawyer." "No," she said, "but you know the law, and I wonder if knowing the law and being willing to use it honestly is sometimes more valuable than having a piece of paper that says you have permission to." He looked at her sidelong, and the copper light was on his face, and she looked at the road ahead of them with a great deal of concentration. "You are suggesting something," he said. "I am suggesting that these families need someone with knowledge and will in their corner, and that the official channels have demonstrated they are not interested in justice, and that you are not a timid man." She kept her eyes on the road. "I am not suggesting anything beyond that." "You have a gift for saying the exact thing that makes a person unable to pretend they did not understand it," he said. "That is the most useful review of my writing I have ever received," she said, and he laughed, and the sound of it was warm and unguarded and entirely different from the careful, measured quality of most of his speech, and she filed it in the locked part of herself, where she was keeping everything she had observed about Abraham Doyle for the past 6 months. The article ran on Monday. Maria had worked through the weekend, setting every letter herself because she did not want to put Della in the position of knowing the contents before it was in print. She verified everything she could verify independently and noted clearly what she could not. She named Gerald Cass. She named the families. She quoted from the memorandum she had been given, noting its provenance as an internal land office document without naming her source. She wrote with the controlled precision she reserved for the things that mattered most, every sentence weighed, every claim documented. The edition sold out before noon. By Thursday, she had received a letter from a federal lawyer in Albuquerque who had heard about the article and wanted to discuss the family's cases. By the following Monday, she had received a letter from the Santa Fe New Mexican asking if they could reprint sections of her reporting with attribution. By the Wednesday after that, she had heard from 3 people that Gerald Cass had been placed on administrative suspension, pending an official investigation. She was sitting in her office reading the letter from the federal lawyer when Abraham came in again. He looked different than he had the other times she had seen him. Not different in appearance, but different in the way of a person who has decided something and is living now on the other side of that decision. His expression was open in a way that made her feel, unreasonably and with irritating accuracy, as though she had been standing in a room that was slightly too dark and someone had opened a window. "I wanted to tell you that the Delgado family received a notice this morning that their case has been flagged for priority review," he said. "The federal lawyer reached them directly. Apparently your article was the catalyst." "It was your information that made the article possible," Maria said. "Your article is what made it real," he said. "A piece of paper in a clerk's drawer in Santa Fe is not the same thing as 600 people reading the truth in print and passing it to 600 more." He stood with his hat in his hands, and something in his face was doing something she was not entirely used to seeing there. "I wanted to tell you that you are extraordinary at what you do. I have thought this for a long time, and I have not said it because I did not know if you would want to hear it from me." The quiet that followed this was different from the other quiets. "What do you mean?" Maria said carefully. "You did not know if I would want to hear it from you." "I mean," he said, with the same careful deliberateness she had observed for 6 months, "that I am aware that I have been in this town for 6 months, and I have spoken to you perhaps 6 times in that period, and that most of those conversations have been about town business and water rights and land grants, and that I have spent a considerable amount of time trying to determine whether speaking to you about anything beyond town business and water rights and land grants would be welcome." She set the lawyer's letter down on her desk with great precision. "And what conclusion," she said, "did you reach?" "I have not reached one," he said. "That is why I am still standing here." She looked at him. She had spent 6 months writing in a locked journal about Abraham Doyle rather than saying a single true thing to his face, and she thought about that now, about the irony of a woman who made her living on truth keeping the largest one in a locked drawer. "Abraham," she said, and this was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt the significance of it in the particular way she felt important words, as something that shifted the air in the room. "If I were not a person who spent all her time thinking about the consequences of saying things in print, I would tell you that I have been watching you for 6 months, and that everything I have observed has made me wish we were having different conversations than the ones we have been having." He was very still for a moment. "And because you are a person who thinks about consequences," he asked. "I think the consequence of saying it is better than the consequence of not saying it," she said, "since we are both apparently waiting for someone to be honest first." He crossed the room with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic of him, not hurried but entirely purposeful, and he set his hat on the edge of her desk, and he offered her his hand, not as a handshake but simply as an open gesture, palm up, and she put her hand in his, and the warmth of his fingers around hers was both exactly what she had been trying not to imagine and not quite like anything she had imagined at all, because real things never were. "I would very much like to have different conversations with you," he said. "Good," she said. "Start tomorrow, come for breakfast. I live above the office and I make adequate biscuits." "Adequate," he repeated, and the warmth in his voice was something she felt in her chest. "I set a high bar," she said. "I will let you evaluate them independently." He left with his hat and without her hand, but the absence of his hand felt different than it had before he had offered it, and that, Maria thought, was the nature of true things. Once you had acknowledged them, everything around them rearranged itself. He came for breakfast the next morning, and the biscuits were considerably better than adequate, a fact she let him state without contradiction. They sat at the small table in her apartment above the courier, with coffee between them and the spring light coming through the window, and they talked for 2 hours about things they had not yet had the occasion to talk about. She told him about her father, who had been a printer in Missouri and who had treated the written word as a form of faith, the closest thing he had to a religion. He told her about his own father, a man he had admired without reservation and lost before he had finished becoming who he wanted to be, a loss that still sat in him like a stone he had learned to carry rather than set down. He told her about Texas, about the particular quality of the land there that he had loved even while he was leaving it, the way the sky went on farther than a person could justify. She told him about the year she had spent in St. Louis before coming west, working at a newspaper there as a typesetter because they would not employ her as a writer, and how she had learned more about journalism in those 18 months than she had in the years before, because restraint and patience and the knowledge of how a press worked from the mechanical inside were things you could not learn any other way. "Did they know you were writing?" he asked. "My editor there knew. He let me submit pieces under initials. M. Keating." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He told me once that I was the best writer on his staff, and that he was sorry the world was arranged the way it was. I told him that I preferred the honest assessment to the polite one. And then you came here." "And then I came here," she confirmed, "because between 2 rivers and 1,000 miles from anything anyone considered important is, it turns out, exactly where I wanted to be." He looked at her across the small table with an expression that she had been cataloging for 6 months, and that she was only now beginning to understand was not simply thoughtfulness or attention, but something considerably more specific, aimed at her specifically, in a way that made the back of her neck feel warm and the locked drawer of her heart feel less like a locked drawer and more like a door standing open. "I came here," he said slowly, "because a man I trusted told me it was good land and good people and a fair place to build something. He was right about all 3 things." He paused. "He did not tell me about the newspaper. That was a discovery I made on my own." "Was it a pleasant discovery?" "It was," he said, "the most pleasant discovery I have made in some time." They both looked at their coffee cups for a moment with the particular studied attention of 2 people who were smiling, and trying not to show it too openly too soon. Callow Creek being the kind of town it was, people noticed that Abraham Doyle had taken to calling on Maria Keating within approximately 48 hours of his first breakfast visit. This was not malicious attention. It was the ordinary attentiveness of a community that knew its own members and noticed changes, the way a person notices when the light shifts before a storm. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived next door and who had been providing Maria with recipes, and occasionally with gentle, unsolicited commentary on her personal life for 4 years, intercepted her on the boardwalk on the 3rd day and said, with the directness of a woman who had survived 60 years without ever seeing a reason to be indirect, that it was about time Maria Keating let someone take her to supper because living inside a printing press was a fine ambition and also not a substitute for human company. "Mrs. Alvarez," Maria said, "I have always had human company." "You have had people to interview," Mrs. Alvarez said, which was such a precise and accurate distinction that Maria had no response to it. "Abraham took her to supper at the hotel dining room on Friday, which was the nicest place in Callow Creek by a significant margin, its nearest competition being the Cottonwood Saloon, which served food, but in an atmosphere that was better suited to arguments than conversation. The hotel dining room had tablecloths that were laundered weekly, and a cook named Harold, who had worked in New Orleans before a series of personal misfortunes, had relocated him to New Mexico territory, and who still produced dishes that were considerably more interesting than anything else within 60 miles. Maria wore her best dress, which was dark green and had buttons she always fumbled with because they were the kind that required more patience than she generally had in the morning, and she arrived at the hotel at 7 in the evening to find Abraham already there, standing near the entrance in a clean dark coat, his hat in his hands as always, and when he looked up and saw her, the expression on his face was the kind that made a woman glad she had been patient with the buttons. They ate and talked with the ease of 2 people who had been talking for years in their heads and were now finally doing it aloud, and the conversation moved across territory they had not covered at breakfast. He asked her about the stories she had not yet told, the ones sitting in the queue, the ones she was still working up to, and she found herself, with a candor she had not exactly planned, telling him about the piece she had been considering for months on the conditions in the territorial mining camps east of the Picos, where men from Mexico and Chinese laborers were working in conditions she had heard were genuinely dangerous, and where the ownership claimed exemption from any oversight. "That is a difficult story to get close to," he said. "Those operations are controlled by men who have more influence in this territory than is good for anyone." "Difficult and necessary are not mutually exclusive," she said. "No," he agreed, "they are not. How would you approach it?" And they sat there for another hour past when she had expected the evening to end, talking about how you got at the truth of something that powerful people wanted kept quiet, about sources and document trails, and the particular value of people who had been inside a system and could no longer stomach it, about the difference between what was technically publishable and what was true and responsible to print. And Maria thought, with a feeling that was warm and steady and better than anything she had felt in a long time, that this was what she had not known she was looking for. Not someone who would simply admire what she did from a respectful distance, but someone who was genuinely interested in the substance of it, who engaged with the thinking behind it as a real and worthy thing. He walked her back to the Courier after supper, the street quieter now in the evening, the saloon noise coming from the direction of the cottonwood and the stars very brilliant overhead. They stood on the boardwalk outside the Courier's front door, and the night was warm enough to be comfortable, and the moment had a quality she recognized as the kind that either became something or didn't, depending on whether the people in it were willing to let it. "I had a very good evening," Abraham said. "So did I," she said. She was looking up at him, and the lamplight from the window behind her lit his face from the side in a way that was, she thought, unfairly becoming. "I would like to do it again," he said. "Many times." "That is a strong position," she said, "for a second proper conversation." "I have been having this conversation in my head since November," he said. "I have a significant advantage in terms of preparation." She laughed, a real laugh, not the polished social one, but the actual one she reserved for things that genuinely surprised her with their accuracy or wit. "Saturday," she said, "I will cook. Come at noon. And bring that book on territorial water law you mentioned at the council meeting, because I have been meaning to read it." "That is the most romantic invitation I have ever received," he said, entirely straight-faced, and she laughed again, and went inside, and stood in the dark of her office for a full minute with her hand flat against the door, feeling the particular quality of a happiness she had not expected and did not entirely know what to do with, which was, she thought, the most honest relationship she had ever had with any feeling. The weeks that followed were the best of that spring and possibly, Maria thought, the best she had known in Callow Creek. They settled into a rhythm that felt both new and completely natural, the way a word you had been pronouncing wrong sounds suddenly right when you hear the correct version. He came on Saturdays, and they cooked or ate together and talked for hours about everything and nothing. On other days he would stop in at the Courier on small pretexts that fooled neither of them, to drop off a newspaper from Santa Fe that a passing rider had brought, or to mention something he had heard about the road conditions east of town that might be relevant to her reporting. She found herself saving things throughout the week, small observations and ideas, holding them in a specific mental space that was labeled, without her fully authorizing this, "Abraham will find this interesting." She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 12 of the typhoid that swept through their town in Missouri that summer, and who she remembered most clearly as a voice reading to her, a particular low and musical voice that had filled their house from earliest memory, and that she heard sometimes still in the sound of a well-set sentence. He told her about his years in Texas, and the cattle drives he had worked as a young man, the vastness and particular loneliness of the Kishom Trail, the way the sky at night on the open range was a different sky than you saw anywhere else, a sky that made a person feel both very small and somehow expanded, as if they had room inside them they had not known about. He told her, on a warm Saturday afternoon with the windows open and the smell of the desert coming in, about the woman he had been engaged to in Austin when he was 24, a woman named Catherine who had been kind and beautiful, and who had ended their engagement when he left law school. Quite rightly, he said, because she had wanted a certain kind of life that he had not been able to commit to giving her. And he said it without bitterness, and with a fairness that she found privately. Among the most revealing things she had ever learned about a person, it was the right decision for both of us, he said. She married a lawyer the following year. I believe she is very happy. And you? Maria asked. She was looking at her coffee cup. I was not unhappy, he said. I was moving towards something. I just did not know what it was yet. She looked up at him and found him looking at her with that particular quality of attention that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply allowed herself to receive as the thing it was. I think I may know now, he said. The land grants case moved forward through the summer with the slow purposefulness of official processes under pressure from outside. The federal lawyer from Albuquerque, a man named Henry Forsyth, who wrote letters with a legal precision Maria found professionally admirable, managed to get 3 of the 11 family cases reopened for formal review. Gerald Cass was formally suspended in June, and his cases were assigned to a different adjudicator. The Delgado family received confirmation in July that their original grant was valid and that their property claim would be restored. Elena Delgado came to the courier on the day she received the notice, and she sat across from Maria's desk, and she cried, not the dry-eyed way Maria had seen her cry before, but the released way, the way of a person who has been holding something so long they have forgotten they are holding it, and suddenly it is set down. Maria wrote about it, a small piece, not triumphant, just true. She wrote that the law had taken a very long time to arrive, and that it owed apologies it would never formally give, and that the families who had spent years fighting for what was theirs deserved recognition, not for their patience, which had been heroic and unjustly required, but for their persistence in the face of a system that had been actively and corruptly arranged against them. The piece was reprinted in 4 other territorial newspapers. She received a letter from the Santa Fe New Mexican asking if she would consider submitting work to them on a regular basis as a correspondent. She put the letter in a drawer and thought about it for a week. She discussed it with Abraham on a Saturday in August when the heat was the deep, dry heat of a New Mexico summer, and they were sitting on the covered porch of his house along Cutter Creek because it was the coolest place they had found, the creek sound coming up through the cottonwoods and the light coming through the leaves in the shifting way it did in the afternoons. What would it require of you? He asked. Submissions every 2 weeks, she said. It would not affect the courier's schedule. I can manage both. That is not what I was asking, he said. I was asking what it would require of you, not your time. You. She looked at the water moving through the cottonwood shade. It would be seen by more people. The things I write would reach further. Is that what you want? I want the things I write to matter, she said. I have always wanted that. Whether they reach 1,000 people or 10,000 people is secondary to whether they are true and important. Then submit to both and write the truest things you can, he said, as though it were simple, and the thing was, coming from him, it sounded like it actually was. You are very good at that, she said. At what? At reducing things to what they actually are, she said. Most people are very skilled at adding layers to things. You do the opposite. Is that useful? It is remarkable, she said, and did not look at him while she said it, and heard him shift in the chair beside hers and felt his hand settle over hers on the arm of the chair, warm and steady. And she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them said anything else for a while, the creek running through the cottonwoods and the afternoon moving over them like slow water. She kissed him first, which she had suspected she would when she had thought about it, because the honest truth was that she had been waiting for herself to be ready rather than waiting for him to act. And on an evening in late August when he had walked her home from supper, and they were standing in front of the courier in the warm dark with the stars doing what they did over the desert and the feeling of the day still around them. She stood up on her toes and kissed him. And he held still for half a second in the way of a person who is making absolutely certain of what is happening before they respond to it. And then he kissed her back with a thoroughness and a care that was entirely consistent with everything she knew about him. When she pulled back, she said, "I should have done that in November." "I thought about it in November," he said, "but I did not think you would welcome it." "I would have welcomed it in November," she said. "I was simply too sensible to indicate that." "You are not actually very sensible," he said affectionately, and she considered objecting and then did not because he was right and she was trying to be honest about that. September came in cooler, and the drought began to ease slightly with the arrival of the monsoon rains. The dramatic afternoon storms that swept across the desert from the south and filled the creek and brought the smell of wet sage up from the earth like something essential that had been missing. Maria stood on the boardwalk one afternoon and watched one of those storms come in from the south, the black wall of cloud moving over the desert, and she thought about what it meant to live here, in this specific place between two rivers in a territory that was still deciding what it was going to be, and she thought that she would not trade it for any of the places she had come from. The article about the mining camps east of the Picos was the hardest piece she had ever worked on. She spent 3 weeks on it through September and October, riding out twice with Abraham, who had contacts among the workers from his cattle drive years. Contacts who trusted him in the specific way that men who had worked hard physical labor together trusted each other across differences that the larger world insisted were impassable. She spoke to 8 men who worked in the camps, 4 from Mexico, 2 who had come to New Mexico from Sonora, and 2 Chinese men who had come to the territory after the railroad construction further north had ended their contracts there. She spoke through Abraham's translation for some, and through a man named Felipe who was from Callow Creek and who had a cousin at the camps and who was willing to help because he was angry and because he trusted Maria's honesty from having read the land grant's coverage. What she found at the camps was not a single dramatic story, but something more grinding and systemic. 12 and 14-hour shifts, wages regularly shorted through a company store system that kept the workers perpetually in debt to their employers, safety conditions that were genuinely dangerous, and that had resulted in 3 deaths in the previous 18 months that had been recorded as accidents and never investigated. The camp supervisors were men who had been brought in from outside the territory and who regarded the workers as a category of tool rather than as human beings with specific names and families and lives that mattered. She wrote it carefully and completely, with names where people had given her permission to use them and descriptions where they had not, with documented wage records that Felipe's cousin had copied down at personal risk, with a precision of language that was, she thought, the most important thing she could offer in the face of such deliberate and profitable contempt. Abraham read the final draft over her shoulder the evening before she sent it to press. He was silent for a long time after he finished. "This is going to bring you trouble," he said. "Probably," she said. "The men who run those camps have money and lawyers and connections in Santa Fe." "Yes," she said, "and you are going to print it anyway." "I am going to print it because it is true," she said, "and because Emilio Vargas, who is 23 years old and who supports his mother and 3 younger sisters in Chihuahua, has been working 14-hour shifts in conditions that would not be tolerated for any worker who had the protection of being born in the right country, and he asked me at the end of our conversation if anyone would ever know, and I told him yes." Abraham was quiet for a moment, and then he put his hands on her shoulders from behind gently, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head with a tenderness that moved through her like the rain. "Yes," he said, "print it." The article ran in mid-October, and the trouble came as predicted, in the form of a letter from a lawyer in Santa Fe representing the Eastern Picos Mining Consortium, informing her that she was liable for defamation, and that she should cease the publication of false and malicious claims or face a legal action. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. By Thursday, she had received 17 letters from readers expressing support. By Friday, the Santa Fe New Mexican had picked up the story, and the Albuquerque Morning Democrat had run a related piece crediting her reporting. By the following Tuesday, Abraham was sitting across from her desk with 2 of the letters from Emilio Vargas and another worker whose name Maria had agreed to withhold, both of which contained specific factual details that corroborated and expanded on what she had reported, and he said that he had been thinking about the legal situation. "I am not a lawyer," he said, as he had said before, "but I know enough to tell you that they have no defamation case if everything you printed is true, which it is, and which you have documented. The threat is intended to frighten you into silence. It is not working," she said. "I did not think it would," he said with a warmth that was specific and directed and entirely, she thought, what it felt like to be genuinely known by a person. "I have written to Henry Forsyth," she said, "the lawyer from the land grants case. He has agreed to review the consortium's letter and advise me." "Good." Abraham set the letters on the desk. "I also want you to know that whatever happens with this, you are not handling it alone." She looked at him steadily. "Abraham." "I mean it," he said, "not as a suggestion, as a statement of intent." She felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled until it stopped being so, a weight she had been carrying since the moment she read the consortium's legal letter, the specific weight of being a woman alone in a situation where being alone made the threat more real. She had been carrying that weight since she arrived in Callow Creek, in some form or another, for 4 years. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with a fullness she had not always had available for gratitude. The legal threat never became an actual lawsuit. Henry Forsyth sent a letter in response to the consortium's lawyer that was, by all accounts she received afterward, a masterwork of measured legal precision, citing the documented evidence supporting every claim in her article, and noting that any court action would require the consortium to open its wage records and safety logs to discovery, a prospect that appeared, upon reflection, to make the consortium's lawyers significantly less enthusiastic. The threatening letter was not followed by another one. In December, the territorial legislature opened hearings on conditions in the mining camps, citing multiple newspapers' coverage including hers. It was a beginning, not a resolution. She understood the difference and wrote about it honestly, noting that hearings were not the same as reform, and that the men who worked in those camps needed outcomes, not process. It was December, and the town was strung with the particular modest festiveness of a frontier Christmas, pine branches over doorways and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of children more excited than the weather warranted, when Abraham asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon. They walked out along Cutter Creek, where the cottonwood leaves were long gone, and the bare branches made geometric patterns against the cold blue sky, and the creek ran clear and low over the stones. He had been quieter than usual for several days, and she had given him space for whatever was working itself out in him, because she had learned over the months that he was a person who thought deeply before he spoke, and that the quiet was productive rather than troubling, though she was aware that she had watched it more carefully this week than she usually did. They walked for a time without speaking, the cold air clean around them, and then he stopped at a bend in the creek where the bank widened, and the view opened up to the south, the desert floor stretching out in its winter colors, ochre and pale gold and the deep green of the juniper along the far ridgeline. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know before I ask it that I am asking because I am certain, and not because I am hoping you will make me certain, because those are different things and I have been thinking carefully about which one this is." She stood beside him and looked at the landscape and felt the quality of the moment the way she felt important things, as a shift in the air and in herself simultaneously. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since November of last year, which I am aware is the kind of timeline that sounds excessive when stated plainly, but I believe in stating things plainly." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were very direct in the particular way that was entirely his. "I would like to spend my life with you, if you would have me, not because you need anyone, because you plainly do not, but because I believe that what we build together is better than what either of us builds alone, and because I want to know everything you have not yet written in that journal you lock in your desk, and because I want to be the person sitting across from you when you have finished the article that changes something for the rest of your life, if you will let me." The creek ran over the stones and the cold air was very still, and Maria Keating, who had been writing the truth about this territory for 4 years, and who had spent 6 months writing the truth about Abraham Doyle in a journal she kept locked because she was not ready for the truth to be public, looked at the man who had just said exactly the right thing, the true thing, the thing that required no editing or revision, and she said, "I love you too. I have for a very long time. And yes." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small oval garnet, dark red and clear, and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it against the cold air, and then looked at him, and he was looking at her in the way she had been unable to categorize in November, and that she understood now completely, and she kissed him there by the creek in December, and the bare cottonwood branches made their patterns against the sky above them, and the cold was entirely fine. She wrote about it. Not in the Courier, at least not at first, but she opened the locked journal that evening and she wrote, "I have been a coward about this for 13 months, and I am not going to be a coward about anything again if I can help it, which I understand is an overly ambitious resolution, but I am putting it in writing, which means I intend to be held to it." They married in March of 1879, at the beginning of spring, with the desert beginning its tentative return to color, and the creek running higher than it had in 2 years from the late winter rains. The ceremony was held in the small stone church at the north end of Main Street, with the Reverend Hoskins officiating, which was not something Maria had expected to find herself grateful for, but he was the only minister in 40 miles, and he performed the ceremony with a warmth she had not previously associated with him, perhaps because weddings brought out a different quality in people than town meetings did. Mrs. Alvarez cried from the second pew, which Maria had expected. Tom Danvers, the blacksmith, clapped so hard during the reception at the hotel dining room that Harold the cook came out of the kitchen to see what was happening. Della and Tomas, her helpers at the Courier, presented her with a hand-lettered broadside that read, in large and somewhat irregular type, "Extra edition. Maria Keating takes the finest story of her career," and which made her laugh until her eyes watered. Elena Delgado danced at the reception with a joy that was different from grief's opposite. It was grief having been fully processed and returned as something more whole, and she embraced Maria and said, in Spanish that Abraham translated with his characteristic accuracy, that Maria had given her family back their land and their dignity, and she would pray for Maria's happiness every day. And Abraham translated this so quietly and carefully that Maria had to blink several times and look at the ceiling. Abraham moved into the apartment above the Courier, which was larger than his place along Cutter Creek and considerably closer to everything, a practical decision that he made without any apparent concern for whatever a man might be expected to feel about this arrangement, which was entirely characteristic of him. He kept his property along the creek, which they went to on Sundays when the weather was good, and he continued his cattle operation on a manageable scale that kept him busy without consuming him. And he took up, without formally announcing it, the practice of using his knowledge of territorial law to help families with land disputes and water rights issues for no fee, which was not something he publicized, and which she learned about primarily from the people he helped. She submitted the piece to the Santa Fe New Mexican, and then the one after it and the one after that. Her readership grew. Letters came from places further than she had expected, from women in Albuquerque and Colorado, and even one from a woman in Denver who said that reading the Courier made her feel that the truth was being tended to somewhere, which was the best description of what Maria hoped she was doing that she had ever received from a reader. In the spring of 1880, she discovered she was pregnant, which she announced to Abraham with the same directness she brought to everything, and which he received with an expression she had not seen before, a kind of undisguised open joy that was entirely unguarded, and that she filed away in every part of herself simultaneously, the professional part and the private part, and the part that was simply a person looking at the person she loved. She kept working through the pregnancy because there was always work to be done, and because the press did not care that her back ached or that she was tired by noon, and because she was constitutionally incapable of sitting still when there were stories to be told. Abraham helped more with the physical labor of the press without making a production of it, simply shifting the heavy type cases when she needed them shifted and carrying the printed editions when they were stacked without being asked to. Their son was born in October of 1880. They named him James William Doyle, William for Abraham's father and James for Maria's father. He was born in the apartment above the Courier while a Thursday edition was drying on the press below, which Maria would always consider perfect timing, because it seemed right that the first thing he came into was a room that smelled like ink. James was a child who arrived in the world with opinions about it. He was loud and alert and specific in his demands, in a way that both his parents found exhausting and entirely recognizable. Abraham walked him through the nights when he was small, moving through the apartment with the same patient deliberateness he brought to everything. And Maria, waking to feed him in the early hours, would find the two of them sometimes already awake, Abraham talking to the baby in a low voice about whatever was on his mind, the creek and the cattle and the territories, and once she overheard an extended monologue on the finer points of riparian rights that she thought was probably not age-appropriate, but was certainly thorough. The Courier grew in those years. She hired a second typesetter, a young man named Rodrigo who had learned printing in Albuquerque, and who had a gift for layout that she recognized immediately and cultivated with care. She expanded the edition from 4 pages to 6. She established a correspondence relationship with a newspaper in El Paso that allowed them to share stories of mutual relevance, which extended the reach of both papers. She wrote about the railroad when it finally came to the territory in 1881, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe laying track through Lincoln County in a route that passed within 20 miles of Callow Creek, and that changed the economics of the region in every way she had predicted. She wrote about what the railroad meant for the small ranchers and farmers, both the genuine opportunity and the genuine threat, because the same steel rails that carried their cattle and grain to market also carried the capital interests of men who had very different plans for the territory and whose relationship to the land was entirely financial. She wrote about Lincoln County in a way that was balanced and honest, and that earned her a letter from a man in the county who signed himself only as a concerned party, and who suggested that some stories were better left alone, a suggestion she wrote about in the following edition under the headline, "The stories better left alone are exactly the ONES most worth telling," which was perhaps the least subtle editorial she had ever written, and which she did not regret at all. The thing she did not write about, and this was deliberate, was the Lincoln County War itself, the violent conflict between competing cattle and business interests that had been burning through the county since 1878, and that involved, among other participants, a young man named William Bonney, whom people had begun calling Billy the Kid. The violence was real and the story was significant, but it was also a story that the larger newspapers could cover more closely and with less personal risk to her small operation, and she had learned to make the distinction between the stories that were hers to tell and the ones that others could tell better. Abraham agreed with this calculation, though he made it clear he would support her whatever she decided, which was something she had come to understand as one of the fixed qualities of his character, his belief in her judgment even when she was uncertain of it herself. In 1882, James was 2 and walking and talking with the same directness both his parents possessed, stating his observations about the world with a precision that made everyone around him either charmed or slightly alarmed depending on their disposition. He had Abraham's coloring and Maria's eyes, and a personality that appeared to be his own entirely, as personalities are. She was working on a piece about the water rights situation along the Picos that fall, sitting at her desk in the late afternoon with James asleep upstairs and the press quiet for the hour, when Abraham came in from the property along the creek. He set his hat on the rack and looked at her across the office with an expression she recognized as thoughtful and pointed. "What is it?" she said. "I have been thinking," he said, and sat in the chair across from her desk, which Franklin's successor, a black cat named Ulysses, was currently vacating in his favor with great theatrical reluctance. "About what?" "About whether it is time to formally do something I have been informally doing for 3 years," he said. "I have been helping people with land and water claims without a license, which is technically acceptable up to a point, but there are cases I cannot take because I am not licensed, and those are often the cases that need the most help." He looked at her steadily. "There is a legal academy in Albuquerque. I could complete my degree in 2 years with the credit I already have." Maria set down her pencil. She thought about this for a moment, genuinely and carefully, the way she thought about important things. "What would it mean practically?" she said. "I would need to be in Albuquerque for periods of time. Not permanently, I am not proposing we move, but for several weeks at a time on a schedule I could plan in advance. The property along the creek. I have been talking to Miguel Vargas about managing the cattle when I am away. He is reliable and he knows the land." She looked at him. He had been doing this, helping people with the legal knowledge he had, for 3 years without compensation, fitting it around the cattle work and the Saturdays and the early mornings and the late evenings when James was asleep. He had helped 14 families that she knew of with land disputes. He had helped 6 more with water rights claims. He had helped a Navajo family navigate a leasing dispute with the government that had taken 2 years and that he had stayed with without complaint for every one of those months. "You should do it," she said. "You should have done it 2 years ago. I wanted to be certain I could manage it without it becoming a burden to you. Abraham." She looked at him with the directness she had brought to their very first honest conversation. "The things that are yours to do are not burdens to me. You being more fully yourself is not a burden to me. It has never been a burden, and I would ask you not to evaluate it as one in the future." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are extremely good at saying exactly the thing." "I have had some practice," she said. He started the legal program in Albuquerque in January of 1883, making the journey by rail on the new line, a fact that made the railroad's arrival in the territory, which she had covered with thorough professional ambiguity, feel suddenly and personally significant. He was gone for 3 weeks at a time and present for 2 between sessions, and the courier ran exactly as it always had, because Maria was constitutionally incapable of letting things slide. And James was 3 years old and the most definite person in any room he occupied, and perfectly fine. She wrote to Abraham every week, long letters, not love letters exactly, though love was in them the way the structure of a building is in it, not always visible but holding everything up. She wrote about the paper and about James, and about the stories she was working on, and she wrote about the things she observed in Callow Creek that she thought were worth observing, and he wrote back with the same thoughtfulness he brought to everything, his letters full of what he was learning and what he thought about it, and what it made him think about the people he had already helped, and what he might be able to do better. In the fall of 1883, while Abraham was in Albuquerque for his second extended session, Maria made a decision she had been considering for a year. She hired a woman, not as a typesetter or a delivery person, as a writer. Her name was Clara Vega, 22 years old, born in Callow Creek to a family that had been in the territory for 2 generations, and she had been bringing Maria pieces of writing for 18 months, unsolicited and persistent, pieces about the lives of the women of the county, and about the particular experiences of the territory's Hispanic community, and about things she had observed that Maria, for all her attention, had not had access to in the same way. The writing was raw in places and precise in others, and the precision was the kind that comes from genuine talent and genuine investment in the subject. Clara wrote in Spanish and in English with equal fluency, which doubled the reach of what she produced. She joined the Courier in October, and by December had produced 4 articles that generated more reader response than anything Maria had published in 6 months. When Abraham came back from Albuquerque in December, Maria introduced him to Clara with the satisfaction she always felt when a good decision had been made and confirmed. "She is very good," he said that evening at their kitchen table. "She is exceptional," Maria said. "She is 22 and she is going to be better than I am in 5 years, and I find this entirely motivating rather than threatening." "Of course you do," he said, as if this were obvious, which to him it apparently was, and she loved him for that, for the consistency of his understanding of her that did not require explanation or justification, that simply was. He finished his legal degree in May of 1884. He came home from Albuquerque with the certificate and set it on her desk without ceremony, and she picked it up and read it, and then she kissed him and told him she was proud of him. And he said he was not sure proud was exactly the right word, and she said that it was exactly the right word, and that she was correct because she was a writer, and these were her professional instruments, and he laughed and agreed. Abraham Doyle opened his legal practice in Callow Creek in the summer of 1884. His office was a room at the back of the Courier building, because the building was large enough, and because the arrangement seemed, to both of them, entirely fitting. The paper was on one side and the law on the other, both of them in the business of the same fundamental thing, the honest accounting of how people were being treated and what could be done about it. His first official clients were the Delgado family, who had a new complication with their restored land grant that required formal legal navigation. He took their case without a fee, as Alina had expected he would, as he would expect he would. He told Maria this was not a sustainable business model, and she told him he would figure out the balance, which he did, charging the people who could afford it a fair rate and working the rest for nothing. And Callow Creek being the kind of place it was, the people who could afford it tended to send him enough business to keep the lights on. James was 4 that summer, old enough to know what both his parents did without fully understanding it, old enough to wander into the Courier on a Saturday morning and ask his mother why the press was making that noise, and to wander into his father's office on a Tuesday afternoon and ask him what that paper said. Abraham would read him the paper. Maria would explain the press with a patience she did not always have for adults, but found entirely available for her son. James absorbed both with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness, and added them to the growing catalog of things he was assembling about the world. In October of 1884, Maria confirmed that she was pregnant again, and told Abraham in the evening after James was in bed, and Abraham sat very still for a moment with the expression she had come to know as the unguarded joy one, and then he said, "I hope she argues as well as her mother," and Maria said, "You are assuming a great deal," and he said he was willing to be corrected if the evidence required it. Their daughter was born in June of 1885. They named her Ruth Alina Doyle, Alina for no ancestor specifically, but because Maria thought it was a name with weight and clarity, a name that meant something without requiring explanation. Ruth came into the world quieter than James had, observing rather than announcing herself, with a seriousness of expression that made the doctor who delivered her say he had never seen a newborn look more like she had opinions about the procedure. James received the news of his sister with the mixed reaction of a 4-year-old who has been told something significant and is not yet certain how to feel about it. And then one afternoon a week after Ruth came home, Maria found him sitting next to the small cradle talking to her in a very low and serious voice about the creek, specifically about the way the water moved around the stones and why that happened. And she stood in the doorway and did not say anything and felt something in her chest that was simply and completely happiness, the uncomplicated kind, the kind that does not need to be written down to be true. By 1886, the Courier was 8 years old and Maria had written more than 2,000 articles, editorials, and notices by her own count. The paper had grown to 8 pages. Clara Vega had become her co-editor in everything but title, a situation Maria corrected in March of that year by giving her the title formally, making her the first woman to hold an editorial position on any newspaper in the territory, a fact that several other newspapers noted with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The land-grant situation had continued to improve unevenly, as real improvements tended to, with progress in some cases and setbacks in others, and a persistent underlying injustice in the way the territory's legal and governmental structures were arranged that would not be resolved in any single generation. Maria wrote about this honestly. She wrote about the progress without overstating it, and about the failures without despair, because she believed that the honest accounting of both was more useful than the comfortable version that either side of any political argument tended to prefer. Abraham's practice had grown into a genuine institution, with 2 cases before the Territorial Supreme Court in the year prior, and a reputation that had extended well beyond Callow Creek. He was offered, in the fall of 1886, a position with a law firm in Albuquerque. He told Maria about it the evening he received the letter, sitting at the kitchen table while Ruth, who was 18 months and mobile in a way that required constant peripheral attention, explored the territory under the table with great seriousness. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it would require moving to Albuquerque," he said. "It would. And the Courier is here." "The Courier is here," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I told them I was not able to accept." She looked at him. "You already declined. I sent the letter this morning." "Abraham," she leaned forward, "you should not decline an opportunity like that without discussing it with me." "I discussed it with myself," he said, "and then I read your editorial from last week about the water dispute, and then I looked at what you are building here, what we are building here, and I made my decision." He looked at her with the steadiness that was one of the fixed properties of him. "Albuquerque has law firms. This county has very few people doing what we are doing here, and I am not willing to leave it for a professional advancement that would primarily benefit me. It would benefit the people you could help there. It would also benefit people here, and those are people I know and their cases are active, and I made commitments that I intend to honor." He paused. "And this is our home. James knows this creek and these mountains and these people. Ruth is going to know them. This is where I want to raise them." She sat with this for a moment, and the moment had a quality of fullness that she had come to recognize over the years as the feeling of things being right, genuinely and completely right, not easy or uncomplicated, but aligned with their true nature. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. Ruth pulled herself up on Maria's knee and regarded them both with the serious observational quality that had characterized her since birth. The years built on each other with the particular solidity of a life being lived at the right speed. James started school at 6, in the schoolroom at the south end of town, with a teacher named Mr. Albright, who had come from Kansas and who had the intelligence to recognize within the first week that James Doyle was not a conventional student, which he handled by giving the boy more books, which was the correct response. Ruth started school at 5, earlier than was customary, because by 5 she was reading with a fluency that made waiting another year seem arbitrary and counterproductive. Both children were regular visitors to the Courier's press room and to their father's law office, a fact that neither parent engineered deliberately, but that seemed to happen naturally from proximity and curiosity, and the general atmosphere of a household where important work was taken seriously. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was deep in the discussions about statehood that had been ongoing for years, and that would continue, in the frustrating way of territorial politics, for considerably longer. Maria wrote about statehood with consistent and careful attention, noting both the genuine significance of political representation and the genuine questions about what kind of state New Mexico would be, whether the rights of its Hispanic and indigenous populations would be protected or subordinated in the architecture of a new state government. She wrote one editorial in October of 1889 that she considered, looking back on it years later, among the truest things she had ever put in print. It was about the newspaper itself, about what it meant to have run the only newspaper between two rivers for 11 years, about the specific responsibility that came with being the only voice carrying certain stories, and about what she hoped the Courier would remain regardless of what happened to the territory or the country or the world. An honest account of the true nature of things, as precisely as any single person could render it, with the full understanding that precision was not certainty, and that honesty required the constant willingness to be wrong and to say so in print. Abraham read it at his desk and then came into the press room where she was working, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she knew well by now, the one that meant he was feeling something he was going to express carefully. "This is the best thing you have ever written," he said. "I hope not," she said, without looking up from the type. "I hope the best thing I ever write is still ahead of me." He came across the room and stood behind her and rested his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back slightly against him, and the press smelled like ink and metal, and the afternoon light was coming through the high windows, and James was in school, and Ruth was with Mrs. Alvarez learning to make tamales, which was either an excellent or a disastrous idea depending on how you felt about the combination of a 7-year-old and a cooking fire. "It very likely is," he said, and kissed the top of her head. The story she had not had the courage to print had been printed by life itself, in the most thorough and irrevocable way, written not in the careful columns of the Courier, but in the accumulated record of what they had built together. The paper and the practice and the two children who moved through the world, with the confidence of people who had been given both honest accounts of it and genuine love within it, which were, she had come to believe, the same two things she had always been trying to provide to everyone who read what she wrote. In the spring of 1890, the same season that had brought Abraham Doyle's first breakfast visit to the apartment above the Courier 12 years prior, Maria sat at her desk in the early morning before anyone else was awake, with the press cold and the street empty outside, and the light coming over the desert in the particular way it came in spring, warm and clear, and suggesting the specific promise of early things, and she opened a new journal. Because the old ones had long since been filled, and she was on her 6th, and she wrote something she had been composing for months without writing it. She wrote about the newspaper, and about the territory, and about the families whose land had been returned, and the workers whose conditions had been improved, and the children who were in school, and the laws that had been changed, and the ones that had not, and the ones that still needed changing. And then she wrote about Abraham, not in the guarded way she had written about him in the first locked journal, not in the precise journalistic language she had used to try to keep her own feelings at a professional distance, but directly, in the plainest and most exact language she had. She wrote that he was the story she had not had the courage to print, not because it was a story she was ashamed of or uncertain about, but because it was the largest and most real thing in her interior life, and she had not been certain she had the language for it, and she had spent years learning the language by living it. She wrote that the courage she had found was not the courage to be less afraid, but the courage to act in the presence of the fear, which was the only real kind of courage, and that he had taught her that, not by instructing her but by being consistently, unfailingly himself, which was the most instructive thing a person could do. She wrote at the end of the entry that she was happy in the specific and serious way that she had learned was the only kind of happiness that lasted, the kind that was made of real things, honestly encountered and honestly kept. Then she closed the journal and left it on her desk, unlocked, and went downstairs to start the press. Abraham came down an hour later with James, who was 9 and already had opinions about the Thursday headlines, and Ruth, who was 4 and determined to be involved in whatever James was involved in, and the apartment filled with the sound of morning and breakfast, and 2 children who were themselves in the uncomplicated way of children who had been given room to be so. And Maria looked at Abraham over the children's heads, and he looked back at her with the full steadiness and warmth of 12 years of honest living. And she thought that if she had been writing this as a story, she would have said something precise about the quality of that look, and the way it felt to be on the receiving end of it. And then she thought that some things did not require the press at all, and she smiled at him across the kitchen, and he smiled back, and the day began. The Callow Creek Courier ran for 30 more years after that spring morning. It outlasted the territorial period, reporting honestly on New Mexico's eventual statehood in 1912 with an editorial from Maria that was quoted in 3 other newspapers and framed on the wall of the territorial archives in Santa Fe. It outlasted Gerald Cass and Harlan Price and every other man who had ever sent a threatening letter to its publisher. It outlasted every prediction that a woman could not run a newspaper between 2 rivers at the edge of a territory that was still deciding what it wanted to be. Abraham's practice grew and held its shape, never becoming the kind of operation that forgot why it had started, never losing the particular quality that made the people who needed help most willing to come through his door. He argued before the New Mexico Supreme Court 9 times over his career, and won 7 of those cases. And the 2 he lost he appealed with a thoroughness that the other side found exhausting, and that resulted in eventual resolution on terms he could accept. James Doyle went east for law school, as his father never quite had, and came back to New Mexico afterward, because he was his parents' son in the essential way of people who have learned what they love from the people who love them. Ruth Doyle worked at the Courier for 3 years after finishing school and then moved to Albuquerque, where she became, in 1910, the first woman admitted to the New Mexico bar, a fact that Maria reported on the front page of the Courier with a restraint she found genuinely difficult to maintain, and which she thought her readers probably appreciated, though Clara, who was by then co-owner of the paper, told her she should have taken up the whole page. Clara Vega ran the Courier with Maria until 1915, when Maria stepped back to a contributing editor role, and then ran it herself with the same commitment to exactness and honesty that she had brought to it from the first article she had published there at 22. The paper she ran was recognizably descended from the one Maria had founded, which was the best thing Maria could say about any inheritance. In the evenings of the years that accumulated, Maria and Abraham sat on the porch of the house they had built on the property along Cutter Creek, the same property where he had been sitting the first time she had really let herself look at him in the afternoon light, and they watched the desert go through its seasons with the satisfaction of 2 people who had chosen exactly the right place to make their life and knew it. The creek ran through the cottonwoods as it always had. The stars over the desert were the particular private spectacular they had always been. The town of Callow Creek grew and changed and stayed itself in the ways that mattered, and the newspaper in the middle of Main Street went on doing what it had always done. She still got ink on her fingers. It still never entirely washed out. And it was still, after all the years and all the stories, exactly the right proof that the words she put to paper were real.